Hi everyone, welcome back to Millennial Finance 101. I'm Patrick. Thank you guys for checking out my channel. Today we're doing microeconomics, and more specifically than microeconomics, we are going to be doing curve shifts. So I know you guys have had a lot of problems with supply and demand, and I'm going to show you the tried and tested way to get the answer right all the time. So today we're going to focus on the fundamental shifts of supply and demand. So if you guys are ready, let's get started. First thing I want you guys to remember are the two acronyms I taught you before. The first one, Mr. Those are all the factors of demand that will shift the demand curve. The second, refit. Those are all the factors that are going to shift the supply curve, and those should be committed to memory. So let's write these down. So demand is going to be Mr. And then supply is going to be refit. Now, all of these questions are not only going to be about identifying which way the graph shifts, but it's also going to be making sure you're shifting the correct graph. So we're going to do different practice questions just to make sure everyone understands this to a T. So even before we start, you guys should get into the habit of always drawing the graph first. For supply and demand, we're always going to start at this point. So price is going to be vertical axis. Quantity is going to be our horizontal axis. Now let's start with question number 1. This question number 1 talks about complementary products, right? So the question is, if the price of K declines, the demand curve for the complementary product J, and we're trying to figure out how it will change. So now the question tells us it's just going to be demand, right? We don't have to figure out whether it's a related good in terms of supply or a related good in terms of the demand. The question gives us a hint, it is just demand. So let's draw our demand curve. Remember, our demand curve is always downward sloping, and we discussed this before, but because it's the income effect, the substitution effect, as well as diminishing marginal utility. So let's look at our options here. The demand curve for a complementary product, is it going to shift to the left? Is it going to decrease? Is it going to shift to the right? Or is it going to remain unchanged? So complementary products, right? This goes back to Mr. and it talks about a related product. Remember, substitute goods and complementary goods are going to affect our demand curve. So we know it's going to change. Now the question is it going to increase or is it going to decrease? If the price of a good decreases, demand will increase. Now, for complementary goods, these are goods that go together. So if the price of a complementary good decreases, the demand will also increase. Think of it like this. If the price of milk goes down, the demand for cereal is also going to increase. People drink a lot more milk, they'll drink it with cereal. So if we know that demand is going to increase, we know our graph is going to shift to the right. And that's all we have to do for number 1. Let's read through number 2 together. So it says, which of the following would not shift the demand curve? A widely publicized study which indicates beef increases one's cholesterol, that will shift it because that tells us about changing tastes and preferences. A reduction in the price of cattle feed. Now, we saw this question in a previous example, so in a previous video, so I just wanted to make sure you guys were all paying attention. But that is going to be the actual answer. But let's go look through the next one. An effective advertising campaign by pork producers. Pork producers, that was a question about what? Substitutes, right? So pork producers are a substitute, it's a related good. That's going to be something that will shift the demand curve. And then the last one is a change in the income of beef consumers. So beef consumers, again, that's a taste and change in preferences. So these are going to be, that's the reason why the answer is option B. But let me give you another trick question. Let's say one of the options was a change in the price of beef. Would a change in the price of beef shift the demand curve? And the answer is no. So let me show you why. We have our general demand curve here, right? Now let's say the price of beef is $15. A change in the price of beef, let's say it goes down to $12. If it goes down to $12, it intersects our curve just at a lower point. Now that goes back to the main idea. A change in price does not shift the graph. A change in price is a movement along the graph. It's going to be a movement along the curve. So I want you guys to commit this to memory because your teachers will 100% ask you and 100% trick you. A change in price is a movement along the curve. A change in the Mr. factors is a movement of the curve. So keep that in mind. Sound good? Great, let's move on now to question number 3. So the question says, if oil executives read the newspaper that massive new oil supplies have been discovered, what will happen to the supplies of oil today? Now the difference is it will only be useful in 10 years. So when they say it will be useful in 10 years, we have to go back. We know the question is going to be related to supply. We have to go back to refit and figure out which of these factors are actually changing or if it's actually changing at all. So if it's going to be useful in 10 years, this is going to affect our expectation, the E part of refit. So we know it is going to affect our supply curve. Now we have to figure out whether or not it's going to increase our supply curve or decrease our supply curve. But let's draw our supply curve first. So our supply curve we know is always going to be upward sloping because of the law of supply, right? If prices go up, producers want to produce more. So it says here that it's going to be useful in 10 years, right? But because the expectation that is going to be useful, expectation will increase our supply. That being said, how is our graph going to change? Is it going to move to the right or is it going to move to the left? Well, if it's increasing, it should be moving to the right. Make sense? Now, let's drive this home a little bit and integrate it with the demand curve, just so we can see how we can make predictions or assumptions based on this graph. If we draw our demand curve like this, right, our initial equilibrium point is going to be right here. And that pertains to a price, we'll use some imaginary numbers, a price of 20 and a quantity of 50. Now, we know that because the expectation increase, supply will increase, we know our graph is going to shift to the right. But what happens to price and quantity? You can see here that our new equilibrium point, let's label our first equilibrium point E1, and we'll label our second equilibrium point E2. We can see our second equilibrium point right here pertains to a price that is below 20, let's say it's 15. It also pertains to a quantity that is higher than 50, let's say it's 60. Now, the numbers here don't necessarily make or need any validation. All we really need to make is a conclusion that the prices are going to go down and the quantity is going to go up. And if you remember how to draw this graph and that supply increases will move the graph to the right, you will always make this conclusion correctly. Sound good? All right, let's go to the next question. The next question here says, the price of computer memory chips increase. So if we're in the market for computers, what should we expect to change? So we're talking about memory chips and we are in the market for computers. So what is the relationship between memory chips and computers? So everyone knows here, memory chips are used to build computers. memory chips are going to be an input. So, memory chips, we know that's going to affect supply, right? So it tells us here the price of memory chips increase. So if the price of the memory chips increase, what does that mean? That means for suppliers, your inputs are more expensive, you are making less of a profit. What happens when you make less of a profit? Well, you produce less because you're not making the same amount of money. So if the price of memory chips increase, we will expect our supply to decrease. Now, let me show you how it's going to look on a supply and demand curve. If we only have one shift, we can make conclusions based on price and quantity after the shift. So let's see what we got. We're always going to start again. Demand downward sloping, supply upward sloping. The memory chips is only going to affect our supply curve. So as we said, it's going to go down. When supply goes down, the graph shifts up and to the left. So our new graph is going to look like that. So let's do our equilibrium points. Our initial equilibrium point here, E1, let's use numbers. Numbers always make it easier to remember or recognize the changes. So let's say that's 20, and we'll say that's 10. Now, our new equilibrium point is going to be right there. We're going to call that E2. And if you look at the lines that we're drawing from the equilibrium point to our axes, you can see here that our quantity has decreased and that our price has increased. So you can make definite conclusions based on that. Make sense? Awesome. Let's go to the next question. Say your income increases, and the question's asking us how your income increase is going to affect the market for bus rides. So let's try and break this down, see which curve it's going to affect, and then see what conclusions we can make about price and quantity. So income here we know is going to affect our demand curve. Income is going to be the I in Mr., so we already know it's going to be a demand-related shift. But now let's look at what the subject matter is. The question's asking us about bus rides. If you are a normal person, right, and your income increases, are you going to take the bus more or are you going to take it less? So that's where your teacher will get you. Your teacher loves to throw practical real-world examples to kind of throw you off. So if your income increases, you're going to be taking less bus rides. And why is that? Buses are technically an inferior good. If you make more money, you'll take, more Lyfts, more Ubers, taxis, Subway, you name it, but you'll take the bus less. So our demand for bus rides is actually going to go down. Now we can graph and see how this changes. So we have our demand and supply here, our equilibrium point right there, and then, let's just draw the same random numbers I always come up with. Now let's do our graph shift and see how this changes price and quantity. So if our demand is going to decrease, anytime we have a shift in demand decreasing, the graph is always going to go down. So our new point is going to look like this. And our new equilibrium, right there. So let's draw the corresponding price and quantity. We'll call this 15, and we'll call this 8. Again, the numbers don't matter, the direction is what matters. So we already could tell here that the change in quantity is actually going to be a decrease, and the change in price, also a decrease. You guys, thank you so much for checking out my video again. I'm going to be taking you guys through the entire Econ syllabus for microeconomics, macroeconomics, and basically anything you're interested in. Please leave a comment below. Don't forget to like and subscribe and tell all your friends. And I look forward to seeing you guys at the next video. Again, this is Millennial Finance 101, and I'm Patrick. Peace.